I'm going to be going over some of Breath of the Wild's most massive flaws and how potentially Breath of the Wild 2 can correct them. Let's dive in. Breath of the Wild is critically acclaimed as one of the greatest Zelda games of all time. Now, despite this, the game is fundamentally flawed and has a lot of issues. Now, from the lack of traditional dungeons, lackluster puzzles, an extremely coherent story, and a Link with no character, Breath of the Wild was, to me, it just wasn't that great of a Zelda game. Now don't get me wrong, it was a very good game. It just simply isn't as great as people make it out to be, and I think it's one of the most overrated games of all time, simply because it's Zelda. Now recently I have been replaying through Ocarina of Time, and in contrast to Breath of the Wild, it has so much of what the title is missing. Breath of the Wild laid down a fantastic foundation on the future of the Zelda series, but hopefully Breath of the Wild 2 has potential to rectify Breath of the Wild's flaws. First thing I want to talk about, DFM, is bringing back the traditional dungeons. Now, while Breath of the Wild took some interesting choices with regards to the dungeons of Breath of the Wild, there's legit only 4 of them, and the puzzles in the dungeons weren't that complicated, and that's an understatement in my opinion. The shrines, totaling over 100, they were a nice touch, and they did have some interesting puzzles, but they were extremely short in that they simply, to me, were not up to par. Now, the Zelda franchise has always been about dungeons and puzzles. Puzzles are the reason why I love the Zelda franchise so much. Now, the open world aspect of Breath of the Wild was insane and I loved every minute of it. To me, it kind of failed miserably on the dungeon and puzzle front. Now, not only that, but the bosses of the game lacked variety. There was only 5 dungeons and 5 bosses, and they were all different variations of Calamity Ganon. To me, this is kind of lazy, and with the promise of Ganondorf in Breath of the Wild 2, the game has the potential to finally return to its roots. I always refer to Ocarina of Time because that, to me, is the best Zelda game in the Zelda franchise. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, DFM, is just the story. Breath of the Wild's story is terrible. Now, while Ocarina of Time's story was pretty simple, it was executed to perfection. It is pretty unfortunate because Breath of the Wild has the foundation down and set. The only problem is that the story of the game takes place 100 years ago, so the memories are disjointed and they don't really add a coherent narrative to the story. Now, it's possible to have an open world game and a fantastic story, but Breath of the Wild failed at this, in my opinion. One of the most exciting things about Breath of the Wild 2 is, in fact, the return of Ganondorf. He hasn't been seen since Twilight Princess in 2006, and this is by far the best villain in the Zelda franchise, if not in video game history. Every game he's appeared in has had a fantastic story, examples being The Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess. Now, even an incarnation of his hatred, Demise, appeared in Skyward Sword, which arguably has the best story in the franchise. Now, Breath of the Wild 2 needs a superb story in order to be considered an excellent game. The trailer hints that the game will not only have an open world aspect, but will also be more story driven. Now, if this is the case, Breath of the Wild 2 has the potential to not only fix the original's missteps, but also has the potential to be one of the best games of all time. Finally, DFM, I would really like to see Breath of the Wild 2 make an emphasis on an expressive Link. Now, one of the many great things about the previous Zelda games is that Link has character. First thing that steps out to me personally is in Skyward Sword. Just the facial expressions and everything just made Link seem more personable. He's expressive from his mannerisms to his facial expressions. This was lacking in Breath of the Wild and was one of the things that I noticed almost instantaneously. To me personally, I felt like Link was most lifelike in The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and, as I mentioned, Skyward Sword. He even had some character in Ocarina of Time, but due to technology at that time, It was hard to convey the complexities of facial expressions in video games. Now, Link in Breath of the Wild lacks all of this, which takes away from the game. I never felt like I was Link. He was pretty boring and bland. This may be because there was a lack of story and he was a blank slate, but regardless, it was a step backward for the character. I feel like Link needs the determination and character that he so blatantly expressed in previous games like Skyward Sword. I feel like this is one of the biggest problems in Breath of the Wild, although it may seem like a rather small gripe to some people. Link needs a drive and a motivation, and possibly the introduction of Ganondorf may very well give him that in a story-driven game. All of this said, did really enjoy Breath of the Wild. It's a very good game, it's just not the best to me. It lacks many of the things that made Zelda such a timeless franchise and traded that off for an open world adventure. Kudos to Nintendo for trying something new. Breath of the Wild set the foundation for an excellent Zelda game, but it fell short because some of the fundamental flaws in its design. Now Breath of the Wild 2 has the chance to rectify this. As long as the dungeons are brought back, there is a coherent story, and mind-bending puzzles are brought back, the game will not only be the greatest Zelda of all time, but the greatest game of all time. The foundation is there, the potential is there. Let's just hope Nintendo delivers on their next iteration of the Zelda series. Alright dear fam, so that is all that I had for this video. I hope you found some value. If you did, consider subscribing to this channel for weekly Zelda videos. Until next time, continue to be the light in somebody's life. Go ahead and check out another video on the channel. We talk a lot about Zelda, and I hope you find some value in those videos. I'll see you soon.